So, Chris, we have a lot to talk about this week regarding kids and technology, some of which I am warning listeners may get a little bit dark. So, before we start, let us remind each other about how the internet can be fun.
Totally.
What kind of fun thing did you find on the internet this week?
You know, it's always an interesting week when Jack Dorsey drops another product, especially,
Yes.
kind of in the blockhead lineage. And so he's been doing a bunch of interesting things in the agent world. First, he launched something called Buzz to reuse Google's old product name, which I worked on. But this week, he launched something called Bird, BERD.xyz. And I found this to be so cursed and so bizarre, and yet very worth looking at because, I think a lot about AI and creativity and expression. And literally it's like going into the Willy Wonka factory and seeing a bunch of Willy Wonkian agents running around that do things for you. And the characters are quite literally out of a Willy Wonka type 1930s style movie. And so imagine ChatGPT, but in a Willy Wonka factory. And that's kind of what Bird looks like.
Yeah, I did see that. And it is... I keep hearing people building similar things themselves, personally. I have a friend who's set up, has a whole bunch of different AI agents running, but he has built a little anthropomorphic system so that when an agent isn't working, it shows it's sleeping.
Yes.
And he can click on it.
There are these pets that you can enable inside of ChatGPT. It's a whole trend.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to see more of them. And it's finally because, once you have all these agents, they need some sort of identity, some kind of expression, or else you lose track of them. They are like pets. And so I think that's what this is showing us. And it sort of leads into a story that we'll talk about later around the AI companions.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I will say the fun thing that I found this week was I went down this rabbit hole. I did not know about this. You might, because you know about everything that is happening on the internet. But this concept, which I guess first became very popular in South Korea and is now spreading around the world, which is vaguely referred to as dopamine shopping. Have you come across this?
Oh, I can sort of instantly get an image for what this might be, but please go on, tell me more.
So it's basically based on the idea that a lot of people, e-commerce is very easy. We all use it in some form or another. And there are times where it feels like maybe some of us buy stuff just because it's fun to shop online.
It feels good, of course. Yeah, it's shopping therapy, used to be something we do in the real world.
Exactly. But this trend, and there are a bunch of different sites for it, and I have gone down the rabbit hole of looking at a whole bunch of them, is allowing you to shop without the actual shopping.
Oh, man. Oh, so it's you have infinity dollars, and you can buy everything, and you can LARP as an internet shopper.
Yes, exactly. It is exactly that.
I kind of love this. Wow.
You can put in your address, and it will track where the non-existent package is, showing it traveling to you, even though no money is, you put it in your shopping cart, you can put in fake credit card details on some of them or whatever, and they don't charge you, but you can track your package, you can see it shipping to you, you can buy all sorts of expensive stuff, clothing, electronics. So the main one I found was called dopamineshop.co, but there's also Food Never Comes, so you can order food that literally never comes, or Fake Eats, which is like a DoorDash kind of thing. So you can, if you're too obsessed with that, there's a whole bunch of these sites, and I was overjoyed. I'd find it.
It's so Matrixian. It's just if we're wondering if we're living in a simulation, now you can literally shop. Honestly, I would imagine people would pay a subscription for this. That would actually lower the cost of their monthly spend. And they'd have less crap that they have to deal with. I don't know what that would do for, the actual retailers, but I kind of love-hate this.
It is fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hello and welcome to Ctrl-Alt-Speech, the podcast where we make sense of the major debates shaping online speech, platform power, content moderation, I guess fake shopping, and the future of the internet as well. It is August 20th, 2026, and this week we're discussing how schools are dealing with technology, how courts are looking at technology, why Discord made some changes in Brazil, and for our Patreon subscribers, the rise of AI companions around the globe and the laws that seek to regulate them. Ctrl-Alt-Speech is my weekly venting session hosted by me, Mike Masnick, the founder and editor of TechDirt. And this week, My regular co-host, Ben, is on vacation, so we have a special guest host. This is Chris Messina, who has been involved in Silicon Valley and open source software and social media for a couple decades now. But it has to be said, every time your name is mentioned, your biggest claim to fame, and I know this hangs over you like an albatross, is that you are the inventor of the hashtag.
That's true. That is true.
So whether you like hashtags or hate hashtags, Chris is to blame.
Yes, I am. And we just actually celebrated or ridiculed the 19th birthday of the hashtag. So the hashtag predates almost all of these topics that we're talking about today.
Yes.
So if I have a jaded or dated lens, it is because of that.
Excellent. I will note that Chris is a Patreon supporter.
I am.
As
yes.
are many other listeners.
Highly recommended.
And so you too can support us via Patreon, and you will get early access to episodes, longer episodes with a more in-depth story as well. And also at certain levels, a chance to submit suggestions for other stories to cover. You can find us at patreon.com/Ctrl-Alt-Speech. That's CTRLALT speech, which you know how to spell.
I hope so.
Also, if you sign up during the month of August, which somehow is rapidly coming to a close, it's
2/3 over. It's amazing.
Incredible. If you use the discount code TrustCon, all capital letters, TRUSTCON, you get 90% off your first month, which means you have nothing to lose, or rather maybe $1 or so to lose. All right.
Take all the money you save from dopamine shopping and put it into this podcast.
Exactly. Thank you. That is the sales pitch. Let us get into this week's stories. Chris, both you and I have kids in high school, and I think we have both been thinking a lot about back to school stuff because that is the time of year.
It starts early in California.
Yeah.
It's already happened.
It has already happened. I have one kid in high school and one in middle school, and somehow in where we live, the high school and the middle school are in different districts, which means they have different schedules.
Oh,
and
that's
so
painful.
They started at different times and different weeks, which has been bizarre. But my kids are back to school, as are yours. And so we've been thinking about the back to school and technology side of things. So you found a story that you thought was interesting and worth talking about.
Yeah. So my 16-year-old, went back to high school in Oakland and came home with a new set of restrictions on their devices, and there had been some restrictions last year. But this year, there was a new California law that effectively makes it so that kids cannot use their devices all day long. And in fact, from the start of school, they have to put them in these little pouches. That's one of the things that my teen is most annoyed by. It's like, why are they spending all this money on these stupid pouches when kids are just finding ways to get around them? But it sort of brings to light, I think, the real world implications of a lot of the topics that you guys discuss here in terms of when these bans go into effect, how they affect kids, whether or not these things are actually effective, as you and Ben have discussed, how kids find a way around these types of prohibitions. I've heard that even some teachers in the schools are actually giving their kids who go to these schools burner phones to put into the pouches because there's no verification. And that effectively these little pouches, I guess, are magnetized. And so essentially, you put the device in the pouch, it's like magnetically sealed. And then later in the day, you sort of go through a process of demagnetizing it. And the magnets themselves, I guess, are not guarded. So kids will just go and sort of like open the pouches. So it's just this like cat and mouse kind of arms race circumstance, presumably with the intention, I guess, of preserving kids' attention and helping and supporting them in focusing on their schooling. But it also feels a little bit like, I guess there's a question of like, when and how should kids learn effective use of technology?
Yeah.
And whose responsibility in society is it? And is prohibition the best way to arrive at an outcome where kids are savvy about how to use these technologies in effective and pro-social ways? And I don't know that we have like a permanent answer to it. And I don't know that there is just one answer. But seeing these bans go into effect sort of feels like both, I don't want to say it's like the easiest and simplest thing to do, but from an adult, older generation who's like looking at the kids, barely looking at themselves and saying, oh my God, we must do something, putting the devices in a hermetically sealed envelope for the course of the school day feels like, job done. I can like wipe my hands and move on. And yet it doesn't actually, I think, address the underlying issues around how society and culture needs to adapt and change to one where these technologies are part of our everyday experience. One of the things that was crazy about this was just that on one of the syllabuses, it sort of outlined the expectations for the kids for the year. And one of them was, of course, no devices in class. And the very next line was, and we will be distributing the assignments on Google Docs in Google Classrooms. And like, you're like left to like wonder, like, okay, so you've taken away the devices, and yet that is exactly how the kids are supposed to perform their studies.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I saw with my high schooler too was not just that, like they do take away the devices, but then often they have to do homework where it's on paper and they have to like, like math, they have to
like longhand.
Yeah. Either writing or math where they'll have to do the equations on paper, but then to submit them, they have to take a photo of the homework with their phone and then upload it. And I was just like, oh my God, this just doesn't seem like the right way to be doing this.
No.
And none of that actually does teach kids like the appropriate use of the technology. And there's also this sort of weird assumption that as soon as you either get out of high school or graduate from high school, that you now suddenly you're okay with using the phone when you've had this sort of prohibition. I mean, there are obvious parallels, and not all of them are entirely fair with like underage drinking and stuff like that, where you have the prohibition and you say you can't drink until 21, and you, of course, kids get around it and they figure out ways to drink underage.
Totally.
And then two, like you don't have the kind of thing where you sort of teach kids how to drink responsibly or, be...
like in Europe.
Right.
Ostensibly.
Where they tend to do better. Obviously, there are exceptions and extremes in all cases.
Absolutely.
And so I fear that we're sort of heading down a similar path. It's funny. So the high school here, they're not doing the hermetically sealed pouches. I know a lot of schools are. That has become very popular. I'm in the middle of Silicon Valley. And so I think there's a big push and pull among parents.
100%. Yeah,
and like the school last year, when this law went into effect, they sent out these emails and they had like board meetings or whatever, where they wanted parents to weigh in. And you had very, very extremely different positions where there are lots of people who are just like ban the technology entirely. There are lots of people who are saying like, no, I would like my kid to learn how to use these things appropriately. And there are, some benefits to using them well. And so the sort of compromise that the school has is that, and we had this before, and I have actually spoken about this on the podcast, where every classroom has a board with pockets, not hermetically sealed pockets, just pockets, and they're numbered.
I think that's what OUSD had last year.
Okay. So the high schools here have had that for, I think, going back 3 years now, and they're continuing to use that. Though this year, because of the California law, they're also banning smartwatches, which they didn't before. And so now...
Because kids would be like chatting, using like the watch, right?
Kids will find a way.
They will, yes.
And we've spoken before about the fact that like, if it's not this, they'll build their own social media in like Google Docs comments.
That's
or
right.
The famous one that we discussed last year at some point was Spotify comments. Like kids would pick an old podcast that nobody was paying attention to.
It's like an internet alleyway.
Yes.
And they'll go hang out there.
And just find a spot where they can communicate. I imagine that still happens, but I think there are different things here. We're talking to teachers about it. Every teacher I've spoken to loves the idea of having a school ban. That's one where I haven't heard, like so many teachers seem to say that it does make a difference and that kids are paying more attention in class.
I mean, it's a collective action problem, right? So you kind of have to do the whole school so that there's not kids that are kind of like skirting around it and,
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense.
There were studies where there had been about 10 years ago, there had been there have been attempts to ban phones in certain schools, and almost all of them went back and switched after a few years. And there was a famous one, New York City had done it. And what they found in New York City, though New York City has now since rebanned phones in schools, but they had done it about 10 years ago. And what they found was that the enforcement then was very uneven. And in fact, lower resourced minority students tended to get in trouble much more, that it just became this tool
of like repression.
Exactly. So I worry about that, though it feels like the approach this time around with schools and phone bans is a little bit more thoughtful.
Or thorough.
Yeah. But I mean, as you said, like people are bringing in burner phones. And so the extreme case that lots of parents say is like, well, there are school shootings. If there's a school shooting, I want to be able to communicate with my kid. And I hate this idea that you're not letting me do that. And then there are other cases where it's like there are stories of phones being used to capture a teacher being abusive. And if kids don't have access to their phones, they don't do that. There are stories of school newspapers and student reporters who need their phones to document things that are happening in the school. You know, there are some cases I've seen where like student reporters get an exemption from the rule because they have a legitimate use.
I wonder if they would allow them to go back to like film cameras or something.
Yeah. I don't know. There's all sorts of ways of dealing with this, but it does seem weird. I mentioned to you, like right before we sat down to discuss stories today, I've been out for my morning walk, and I was listening to a podcast in which there was a Gen Z, a young woman who is, angry about how unsafe she believes technology is for her generation. And she, has argued that she had eating disorder problems, which she felt were brought on by scrolling too much Instagram. And she was interviewing Jonathan Haidt, who is, sort of the bogeyman.
One of the progenitors of some of these bands.
Yeah. And it was interesting because she was certainly a huge critic of technology. And he went into the interview sort of thinking like this was his audience and his crowd. And he talks about all the problems that he sees with technology. And about halfway through the interview, she didn't quite turn on him exactly, but she kind of pointed out like, your entire approach is this prohibition and banning, and that doesn't really help because it makes the technology more appealing to young people, and it never teaches us how to use it, and it does absolutely nothing to make it safer for everybody else. And he didn't quite know how to deal with that, which I thought was really interesting as well, that he just kind of like stumbled over it a bit. And there was audience questions, and a couple other people brought up this idea of our community. We meet people and have friends and all this stuff through our phones. They're mediated through our phones, but in many cases, it's been really helpful. And he basically denied their lived experience and was just like, well, if you didn't have social media and the phone, you would have better relationships with people around you.
Okay, boomer.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, I don't know that that's true. There was this assumption that like phone mediated interactions are not real. And I think we need to get past that, because that's not true.
I mean, as we've taken away like third spaces, that are safe for kids to go in, or, we vilified walking down the street, as a solo teenager or teenager with friends, or there's just like fear about other people. It's made it, I think, very hard for people to like, and I know like, at least again, speaking from my experience and with my kids, like they are happy to put the phone down and hang out with friends. They also will use their phone to find new friends. Yes. Instagram is a great place to find and discover people that share an interest in music, going to concerts, things like that. And so, especially if you're in some kind of school environment where there's not a lot of people who are interested in the same things or share your values. I mean, like these types of social platforms cut across all those divisions and allow you like expand the pool of people who you might discover that are actually quite compatible and quite interesting to you. And so it just sort of feels like there's this conservatism in Haidt's approach, where it's like, oh, back in my day when we didn't have these devices, well, we were all so social and we all loved each other and we were all egalitarians and there was no racism and there was no sexism and everything was equal and we just loved each other and kumbaya, man. And you're like, that never happened, bro. Like that wasn't the way things were. And it's not that way now, And so like, you're kind of coming at this from this fantastical perspective that I think isn't, I don't know. I mean, I read his book and I've listened to a lot of podcasts and there's like some useful things in there. Yeah. But my feeling all along, I mean, has been there's a need to figure out how we equip humans and humanity and society to meet this moment, and that we will be using these technologies for a long time to come. And that it requires people to like elevate themselves and to meet the moment and all the challenges that these technologies present to us, as opposed to saying, well, if we just minimize their use or, sequester them, that somehow putting them away and only allowing a certain segment of the population to have access to them, that's the way this is going to go well. I mean, these are information tools. These are social tools. And if people and humans cannot learn to interact together with these tools, we're going to, I think, say pretty stuck in this like adolescent, juvenile kind of moment. And I don't think it's going to be that way forever.
Yeah. I mean, I do think, some of this, and this is not to put it all on the parents, but there has to be some role for the parents as well in terms of helping kids learn to use the technology well, if the schools are not going to do it.
I think this is a very important and dicey topic.
Sure.
As parents, right? Yes. There's a question for us, right? Like, what are we doing or what have we done? What tools do we make available, to help our kids? Like, I'll give you sort of an example. as a relatively tech savvy person, I'm trying to set up my 16-year-old with an Apple Cash account so they can go out and buy things, because it turns out like cash isn't king anymore. Apple Cash is. And so when they want to go to like, the store or whatever and get something, they'll have their phone and they'll use it for that purpose. And there's a process or a flow now that Apple requires a teen to have an ID in order to get an account. And obviously this defends against fraud and other things like that. But the gates that we put in the way of using some of these technologies are, I think, baffling to a teen user. And they don't understand the threats. They don't understand the risks. It's one thing to sort of say, hey, you drink a lot of alcohol, you're probably going to throw up and, make bad decisions. You can point to like movies and things like that to show people what that looks like. On the other hand, when it comes to technology, I think it's harder to provide like a cause and effect narrative or to show technology and be like, we're going to put these parental controls on your device or on your use of Instagram and things like that, because we're anticipating that you may do things that are negative or that you may be bullied or things like that. Now, I would be very interested to know, and I haven't seen any stats on this, like in terms of what the adoption of these parental controls are, because I think the point that you're pointing to is the parents have some duty of care and responsibility, and I agree with that. At the same time, for every single app that exists, there's a different set of parental controls. Yeah. And in fact, ChatGPT just came out with their version of ChatGPT for teens, in addition to the parental controls that they launched last year. And so, we're a Claude household. We're not really a ChatGPT household. So does that mean that I have to go into each one of my kids' apps and turn on parental controls and then learn each of those systems? And again, as technically savvy people, we might be able to do that and make that work. Yeah. On the other hand, for the vast majority of parents who are already stressed out and worried about it, I suppose maybe this is why the prohibition and the ban happens. Yeah. Because getting the time and the attention to fine tune the controls to meet a parent's values just takes too goddamn long. Yeah. And like they may not even have visibility, right? Because like then you talk about like Discord or other platforms that kids are spending time on, and the parents may not have a lot of visibility into what actually goes on in those places.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's funny because Discord also has parental controls. All of these have parental controls. But I mean, the argument I was making was even different than that, even because like I agree, all those things are effectively impossible to keep up with. You might have like on one or two apps, but you can't do parental controls on all the apps. To me, the thing that becomes important is being able to communicate with the kids about like generally understanding potential risks and also having an open path for communication, where it's just like, if you come across something online that you don't understand or is problematic, do you have someone that you feel comfortable talking to, whether it is us, your parents, or if there's a trusted teacher at school or something along those lines, where it's not so much we're going to lock down and limit what you can do. It is like, please understand that there are potential dangers. We can't predict them all. We can't stop you from coming across all of them, but please understand that there's someone that you can talk to if you do come across these things, and to just begin to teach them how to recognize the potential dangers.
I mean, it's a really good point. And I don't think I talked to enough parents like about this specific matter. It's like, if your kids bring you something that's like salacious, or they clearly shouldn't see or shouldn't have access to, but maybe one of their friends sent it to them, or it was just making the rounds. How do you greet that with, curiosity and without shaming them or without blaming them, without saying, how could you look at this? Like, those types of responses, because I think that the amount of content that kids can be exposed to is enormous. Yeah. And it really is more about guiding them, I think, with, support and structure and kind of like welcoming that in, which requires, at least when I think about my parents, like my parents were like, I think pretty aggressive about blaming me and blaming the messenger. Like if I came with a question like, well, what do you think about this? And they'd be like, oh, how dare you, talk about drugs, or something. Right. So it requires, I think, parents to really have that kind of open-endedness when they encounter these types of, materials. And I don't know where the discourse is on that.
Yeah, no, I think it's important. I mean, one of the things that I've tried to get across, and we haven't had to use this, but like I've expressed to my kids that like, if they ever feel that they've come across something where they're in trouble online, to come to me and start out by saying like, I need help, or like I gave them a specific phrase, which is like supposed to signal to me too, like, don't be mad at me. Right now, I need help more than I need you to scold me for this, because
in case of fire, break glass.
Exactly. And so I find that something like that, where it's just like, look, don't think that I'm going to be upset with you. Come to me and be able to talk to me about it. And if you use this, it's like a signal to me now is not the time to worry about why you got into this situation. Let's deal with the situation first. But it's tricky. And like having both parents and kids accepting that, feeling comfortable with that is very difficult. I want to move on. So the next story is sort of similar kind of thing, which is that in France, they put in place a similar social media ban for under 15s. This is sort of copying the Australia ban and elsewhere that is trying a ban, except that this constitutional court said, no, you can't do that. And this was a thing that Emmanuel Macron rushed in. He wanted it to be his legacy, and he wanted it in place before the school year started.
He got it done.
He got it done.
And then it got undone.
And then it got undone by the French Constitutional Court, which was very interesting, where they, a very short, very easily readable decision where they just said, this is way too broad. And even if there is a legitimate interest, and they said, the government has a legitimate interest in protecting children, this is not the way to do it. Kids have some amount of rights as well that we have to respect. And also, the only way to implement this is through universal age verification, and that creates massive privacy problems. And I think was like, it was really good to see the court come out and say that. And I think some of the reasoning behind it also applies elsewhere in Europe, as other countries in Europe start rushing to try and apply this as well. What did you think of that?
Yeah, there's been so many of these now that I guess I wonder, if this is almost like Project 2025 kind of initiative where there's model legislation that has been written and then just gets copied and pasted in all these different jurisdictions. Because
I was going to say, it goes back to Jonathan Haidt. I mean,
yeah. I guess I felt like there was like this, like there was a tipping point after which there was like the narrative. And I do think like, the anxious generation, cauterized, like sort of like mobilized a lot of people to be like, oh, we must take action. We must do something. And then the question is, well, what do we do? And then it's like banhammer. And that became like the solution. And as a result of seeing that play out, I think a lot of the nuance and trade-offs, that many of us in this space have been talking about for years now suddenly come to the fore, because you're like, oh, well, you ban that, but now you have to implement universal age verification. And then we go to the question of, well, at what level of the stack does that exist? And that means now your computer is adversarial to the user because it requires you to reveal information about yourself in order for you to gain access to it. And so that is a very different sort of proposition, where it's almost like a citizenship verification. Now it's like age verification in order for you to use the thing that unlocks communication, unlocks commerce, unlocks all manner of different things. And I mean, just again, going back to my Apple Cash experience, where it's like there had to be like an identity card that was like taking a photograph in order to get the age verification in order to open up this Apple Cash account. Now you're talking about doing that just to allow anyone to use any kind of device. And the ways in which that can go wrong, the problems with that are rife. And so unless you have the apparatus set up to provide support to that, and in the era of like reducing government and Doge and like things like that, that there's going to be this like massive set of people that are disenfranchised because they can't get through the system because they look too old, or they type like an adult, or they don't, or they type like a child and they're 35, and there's just like these false positives, and you're left in this kind of like, limbo state. This, who was the author that talked about being in like this purgatory? Anyways, classic story. Kafka, like a Kafka-esque sort of situation, right? Where like you can't use computers because it thinks that you're like 12 when you're not. So anyways, I think it's good though that the courts are pushing back to some degree, especially in these overly broad circumstances. Because as we mentioned before, it's the implementation and the enforcement that ultimately imperils people who are less well-resourced. And so it's fine if you have like an absolutely like homogeneous society or culture, and it's like relatively small and everyone agrees and has the same values, but that's just not the real world.
Yeah, no, it is tough. It'll be interesting to see what happens with these other laws, but I was sort of pleasantly surprised that the French court was willing to do this.
Well, I guess we'll see, because like the thing that seems to be happening in that case is that they're going to be maybe attempting again, but like with a narrower set of rules.
Yeah.
Right?
And so Macron has sort of instructed the French Assembly to figure out a way to get this through, and he wants it before he leaves office. So this is very much like tied to his legacy, as opposed to necessarily like what actually works, what actually makes sense.
As the guy who was like so pro tech, he's sort of fallen far from that tree, I guess.
Yeah. Now, speaking of kids and safety and everything, and also Oakland, where you were talking about the changes in the Oakland School District, this week there's a trial going on in Oakland about kid safety. And so there was some reporting on that. Do you want to talk a little bit about the reporting that you saw?
Yeah, I mean, this is another one of these big meta trials. It's just like we have like the Jonathan Haidt heard around the world, legislation. I feel like on the other hand, there is a let's get a pound of flesh from these big tech companies for their years of potential neglect or, I don't know, not caring, about the uses of their products. And I guess I want to be mindful that I probably sound, or at least come across as more of an apologist for these platforms. And that's not true. I think that it's subtle and it's nuanced. And again, I guess my trauma, comes from obviously the relationship with the hashtag and people being upset about like abuses of the hashtag. Yes. And I'm like, well, I never intended it for it to be used that way. Right. And so, should I be like, well, I should have taken it back and then not given people the chance to use it? But then it turns out that people have found communities and friendships and all sorts of things. So like any technology, it is a blade that cuts both ways. And I certainly imagine that there were choices that Meta made that were completely commercially oriented. And as a public company that exists in capitalism, they were doing the thing that was necessary to stay as a publicly traded company in business. I think the question is, given that, and given the societal harms, that arose from that previous context, who then bears the responsibility and what do they need to do about it? And so in this case, you have a researcher, like a social science researcher, and when I was at Google, we had a lot of these folks who were also looking into how people use social media and technology. I worked on Google+. And you find such interesting broad spectrum uses. There's so many uses that are so boring and so uninteresting and so basic, and like sharing recipes. That stuff is not going to end up in someone's report, and yet it might actually be like the 70 percentile use case.
Right.
And then you have someone like this who is finding abuse and negative things that humans have done to each other for a long time, perhaps both amplified, and now you're able to detect it because it's happening in a digital substrate. And, he's trying to say, look, Meta knew about these things, should have done more about it, and therefore they're responsible. And so that's kind of, I think, what this trial is about, as many of the trials have been about. It raises just this continuing question about if you know about these things, but it's a minority of cases, and you also implement child protections or parental controls, but then the parents don't use those controls or the children are not guided by the parental figures, is it ultimately the corporation's responsibility to raise those children or to figure out how those kids can or should not be able to access that technology? And I don't, again, as a society, as a free society, one where civil liberties are important, I don't think we found the silver bullet answer yet. So that's my read on this. But you tell me, what am I missing?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm sort of in agreement on that. And it's like, I don't like Meta. I don't trust Mark Zuckerberg. I have all sorts of problems with Meta's platforms, and I don't generally use them. And I have no doubt that he has made many poor choices. But a lot of the headlines this week were about Arturo Behar, I think that's how you pronounce his name, who was sort of this whistleblower who complained, who said, I did this research and I found that people were using it in unsafe ways. And I sent all these emails to Mark Zuckerberg and I didn't get any response. And it makes for really great headlines and really great stories. But I don't like those stories because I don't think that they're telling a fully accurate picture of what is going on. Because at any company, you can find, and I'm sure you've experienced this, and I've spoken to lots of people, you can find people who say, well, I had the solution. In my mind, it was, we should have done this, and the bosses didn't, and therefore that proves that they didn't care. And the reality is often somewhat different, which is that they have a bunch of different competing interests, and they have a bunch of different people saying, here are the best ways to deal with the safety aspects of it, or to deal with these other things, or these other competing interests, and they make decisions based on that. And we don't know all of the different competing things, and we can say that we personally disagree with the decisions that Mark Zuckerberg made, and I think there are lots of cases where I did. But to say, because this one person suggested one path, we don't know how viable that path was, or what the trade-offs were, or what the things were, or even would that approach have actually helped. So it's very easy to write these headlines, and I'm sure they work well in court, but I find them problematic in terms of using that to define the narrative, which is the same thing with the Francis Hogan documents that came out originally.
The thing that I find so challenging about these stories is if Meta weren't as successful and as broadly used as it is, would anybody care? And the reason why I asked that is because, you look at a platform like Mastodon or Blue Sky, which we've both been involved with, and maybe they didn't make, similar choices that Meta made, and yet fewer people use it. And so there's this question, if you do the right thing, in quotes, and you don't do the things that optimize for growth, and you don't grow and you don't survive, then have you succeeded in addressing the harms that is being brought up in this trial? And so there's a question about like whether, this research, had it been implemented and adopted, would have actually led to addressing those harms, or whether it would have actually caused the business not to continue to grow, in which case, then it wouldn't have mattered anyways. Some other nefarious entity that chose to do the other thing would have
taken all the other people, right? And you can argue that it's like more people went to TikTok because Facebook was focused on all of these like safety things.
That's right.
And you can say TikTok was less safe.
I mean, look at like, not that I'm I guess I'm just using my own experience because it's grounded in reality, but like with Google Plus, we gave people a lot of tools based on the things that they were saying that Facebook was doing that they didn't like. So you could have what we called circles, and you could put all of your contacts into circles, and you could share specifically with just the people that you wanted to share with. And you know what? It was too hard. People didn't get it. And it turned out that they didn't want to actually take advantage of the control. So maybe I'm somewhat cynical because the products that I've worked on, where we gave people what they claim to want in terms of control over their social and digital experiences, ended up being too hard, too much work, and ultimately those things didn't survive the test of time because they didn't get adopted. And so when people complain about Meta, it's like you're complaining about humans and their choices, and yet you want the company to be responsible for just giving people what they want. And so I find that balance in a capitalist context to be very challenging to sort of make sense of. Maybe it's why the democratic socialists are, on the rise, because they want to try a completely different structure. And okay, like if you want to go, systemic, like that would be the way to do it.
I mean, it is funny how few of these conversations take into account like how Wall Street would have reacted. Like you can read the stories of like the downfall of Twitter before Elon took over, where it was like Wall Street came in and effectively threatened Jack Dorsey
that's true.
if he didn't implement a bunch of things that were focused on growth as opposed to actually making the platform healthier. There are all sorts of things where like we should have part of that be part of this discussion, not just like,
because I mean their whole thing was healthy conversations.
Yes.
Like before Elon took over. And now look at the platform. Now,
it's unhealthy conversations is the
right.
Is the new.
It's like it was bought out by the guy who's the richest man in the world to turn it into something that is more like what Zuckerberg built, because that's what people want.
Yeah. Last of our eye-catching stories before we go on to the Patreon section. We'll make this one quick. This is down in Brazil, where Discord has had to ban live streams down in Brazil. This is based off of a very tragic story. And as often happens in these things, there are tragic stories behind the stories, where a young child, I believe 13 years old, was on a live stream and effectively bullied into taking their own life. And
that's right.
That is horrific in all sorts of ways. There's no possible way to describe that in a scenario that is not horrific. The people involved in the bullying to lead to that result have been arrested. And there are cases like this where I see this and you say, this is a law enforcement issue that law enforcement should be taking care of. However, the wife of the president of Brazil took it upon herself to blame Discord specifically and said that they were not doing enough to keep people safe. And there's been an effort to say that Discord is not. There's a new law in Brazil that requires age verification and safety and all this kind of stuff. And they're arguing that they did not do enough to protect against this kind of unique case. And therefore, Discord's position is to ban all live streams in Brazil. And I understand why they would do that. I don't think that helps. I mean, it's the same conversation that we're having over and over again today in this hour of it's easy to say that and it's easy to blame the technology for it. But
I mean, people are just going to go to a different platform. And so maybe because Discord was visible, and obviously this is like a tragedy. Like I can't even imagine what it's like to be a parent of a 13-year-old that decides to do this or is bullied into doing this. I mean, to me, it's a despicable thing for humans to cause other humans to do, period.
Yes.
Whether it's in the real world or whether it's the digital world. The question about whether the platform is liable for this or what they could have done to prevent it, I think is exactly like what we've been talking about. And whether or not age verification would have actually prevented this type of situation from occurring, or if it would have happened again elsewhere, or maybe in a darker alley on the internet as opposed to Discord. And so I don't know. I mean, my heart goes out to like the parents involved and even, you know, to the perpetrators. Like, how horrible must your life and self-esteem be to like treat other people this way through a digital platform? But to your point, from what my read of the situation is, like, Discord was going back and forth between, you know, I think the law came down and then Discord was like, well, we can't do age verification because of these nuances and subtleties. Then they eventually got there, and even still, you know, it didn't work out. Yeah. So I think kids are going to find a way to use, you know, live stream. I mean, this happened on Facebook, you know, when they started doing live streams, you know, and now they've like, you know, implemented a 5-second delay or whatever, and they have AI that's trying to catch these things. But regardless, I mean, who do you call? Like, what's the 911 on the internet when something goes wrong? And that leads to all kinds of, what's it called when, swatting, right? So, you know, like, it can be abused in both directions. I mean, ultimately, why don't we just ban humans from using the internet, and then we'll solve the problem? Yeah. That's joking.
Right. There are solutions to all these things. You could turn off the internet, but there might be might be a few costs.
We'll just go back to killing each other in person.
Yes, exactly. Good God. Well, on that note,
I know. Sorry, we warned you guys this was going to be dark, and I don't know why I feel so dark today.
Going to be a little bit dark. We are going to move on to the Patreon only part of the podcast. If you are not a Patreon subscriber, this is where we say goodbye. But now is a good time to subscribe to the Patreon. You can use the discount code TrustCon, all capital letters, and you can hear the next part of the discussion in which we're going to be talking about more potentially dark subjects about AI companions and mental health and some of the attempts to regulate AI companions. But if you're not a Patreon subscriber, thanks for listening, and go subscribe to the Patreon.
Do it. I did it.
That's the end of this week's free edition of Ctrl-Alt-Speech. To hear the extended episode with additional coverage, become a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/Ctrl-Alt-Speech. That's CTRL-Alt-Speech. If your organization is interested in sponsoring the podcast, contact us via our website at Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com. Thanks for listening.